Black Op Radio presents 50 Reasons for 50 Years. Why the Warren Commission may be the greatest fraud perpetrated on the American public. Now your host, Len Osanic.
Jim Garrison's trial in 1967 opened the doors for release of information such as the Zapruder film and other medical records. This continued with the House Select Committee on Assassinations and other official requests for documents through the Freedom of Information Act. Public interest peaked with Nigel Turner's The Men Who Killed Kennedy and Oliver Stone's JFK. That resulted in the Assassination Records and Review Board. The problem is the public wanted to know more and suspected something was crooked, but the major media often parrot a lone gunman view. To write articles against the Justice Department or an intelligence agency was seen as biting the hand that feeds it. The American dream, it seems, cannot take the scrutiny of its own citizens and hides behind national security as reason not to release documents. After all, the Warren Commission had all kinds of documents and locked them away for 75 years. That must be some kind of evidence so explosive they need 75 years to come up with an explanation, or they would have been waving them around like a flag for all to see. Now and then a few articles get written, reporters, journalists discover facts, documents, which slip through to a waiting public who just want the truth. Jefferson Morley is a journalist who's been writing in Washington, D.C. for years. Here is one man's journey into JFK and the major media.
This is Jefferson Morley from Washington, D.C. My interest in the Kennedy assassination really started to develop in the 1980s. It was not as an investigative reporter. My interest was more kind of cultural. I was interested in movies and fiction that had been inspired by the assassination of President Kennedy or influenced somehow by it. I knew about the many theories. I'd read a few books, but I never really had strong opinions and never really thought of it as a journalistic subject for myself. That changed with Oliver Stone's movie in 1991. I was here in Washington at that time, and the tremendous furor that the movie set off, especially among Washington journalists of my acquaintance. Many a dinner party was ruined that year by intense arguments. And I found that whole phenomenon very interesting. In 1992, when I read that Congress had passed the JFK Records Act, that's when I first was intrigued as a journalist, because it was at that time that I realized there were going to be new records, new government documents about the assassination. In those records, there will be interesting stories. They may not tell us who killed Kennedy, but they'll still be interesting. They'll tell us something about this moment that is so controversial in American history and so filled with confusion and doubt and dispute. I met John Newman, who was a retired Army intelligence officer and also an academic historian. I really liked John Newman's approach to the JFK story. It was very focused on documents. It was very focused on creating an empirical record of what the CIA knew about Oswald and when they knew it. And I began reading all of the new documents that had been released. Not looking for anything in particular, just familiarizing myself with the new evidence. In there, I ran across CIA cables concerning Oswald that were dated before the assassination. They showed that people in the CIA knew who the alleged assassin was. So who were those people and what did they know? That's kind of a basic investigative reporter's question. On several documents, I ran across a name, Jane Roman. She worked in the counterintelligence staff. I thought, well, what if she's still around? She might have something interesting to say about these documents. And I did a little searching. I couldn't find her, but I found somebody in her family who I managed to talk into giving me her phone number. I sent her a copy of the cable, and I said, your name appears on here. Could you talk to me about this document? I went to interview her with John Newman. She said some very interesting things. I wrote up what I found there in a piece for the Washington Post, which appeared in April of 1995. Basically, what Jane Roman said in commenting on the cable was it indicated to her that somebody in the CIA Special Affairs staff, the anti-Castro operation, had taken a keen interest in Oswald. That was her phrase, keen interest in Oswald. That, I thought, was newsworthy. Why would somebody take a keen interest in Oswald when he was completely obscure, kind of a itinerant young man of no particular distinction? Why would people at the top of the CIA be taking a keen interest in him? No CIA officer had ever talked on the record about pre-assassination of Oswald to a journalist before. This is some 30 years after the assassination. I thought that was a good story. I took an interest in the confrontation between Oswald and anti-Castro Cubans in New Orleans in August of 1963. And I took an interest in the group, the Cuban Student Directorate, and looked through the CIA files in the National Archives about them. And sure enough, they had been supported by the CIA. Communications concerning the Cuban Student Directorate were addressed to or from somebody named Howard. And I was trying to figure out who Howard was. So finally I put the question to the JFK Review Board itself, and I said, why don't you ask the CIA who was the case officer for the DRE in the summer of 1963? And I didn't find out the answer for a year. The documents came into the public record, and they showed that the case officer for the DRE, the man named Howard, was in fact a CIA officer named George Joannides. None of this was known to the Warren Commission. This whole area of CIA assets being in touch with the accused assassin before November 22nd, 1963, CIA assets using their knowledge of Oswald to create the impression that Oswald acted at Castro's behest. This really calls into question whether the Warren Commission and even the House Select Committee ever even had the basic records related to the assassination needed to pass judgment. And the fact is they didn't. Not only had Joannides been the case officer for the DRE in 1963, but he had another role in the JFK story. And that was, in 1978, he had served as the CIA's liaison to the House Select Committee on Assassinations. I called Bob Blakey, the general counsel of the HSCA, who I knew slightly, and I said, Bob, do you recognize this name, George Joannides? Did you ever know what he was doing in 1963? He said, well, no, he wasn't doing anything in 1963 because we had an agreement with the agency that we didn't want people who were operational at that time to be involved in the investigation. And I said, Bob, let me show you what he was doing in 1963. And this was a revelation for Blakey, that the man who he had dealt with in 1978 had had a role in 1963, funding the anti-Castro group that had encountered Oswald and publicized his activities, and Joannides had never mentioned it to the House Select Committee on Assassinations, never mentioned it to the investigators. That was a very audacious deception on the part of Joannides and on the part of the CIA, very revealing about their attitude towards the congressional investigation in 1978. I thought this was a terrific story and brought it to the editors of the Washington Post and said, you know, isn't this a great story? And my colleagues disagreed with me. I decided, well, I'm just going to publish the story. And so in 2001, I published what I knew about the story up to that point in the Miami New Times newspaper. And I continued to report on the story. When you report a story, if the CIA senses that you have an institution behind you, like the Washington Post, they'll be more cooperative. I didn't have that. The Post wasn't interested in running the story, so I needed institutional strength on my side, and I realized the way to do that was to file a lawsuit. In 2003, I filed a lawsuit for the records of George Joannides. It's been very difficult. The case was thrown out in 2006. I appealed in 2007. In December of 2007, a federal appeals court ruled unanimously in my favor and said the CIA needed to do more searching for Joannides' records. And as a result of that, the agency turned over a bunch more material to me, and they added to our understanding of the CIA and Oswald and the assassination. There were some travel records in the Joannides material that I obtained after 2007, and they indicated that Joannides had traveled to New Orleans twice in April and May of 1964. Well, that was interesting because that's exactly when the Warren Commission attorneys went to New Orleans to interview Carlos Bringuer of the DRE about the events leading up to the assassination. That's not proof that Joannides went to New Orleans in connection with the Warren Commission, but it certainly opens the possibility that he did. George Joannides was a lawyer by profession, so if he was seeking to protect the agency's interests, he would be well placed to advise people in the DRE about their testimony to the Warren Commission. Joanides had gotten a medal from the CIA. He had received what's called the Career Intelligence Medal, pretty much the second highest medal a CIA officer can receive. And he had gotten it less than 2 years after he had stonewalled Bob Blakey in the House Select Committee. There's still a lot of Joanides material withheld. 295 different records are withheld by the CIA. The CIA says they cannot be released for reasons of national security, and that's a minimum figure because there's a whole nother set of operational files in which the CIA will neither confirm nor deny that the files exist. Now, given that Joanides was an operations officer and his job in Miami was the chief of the psychological warfare branch, he was running operations. So there's at least 295 records that we've never seen, and there's probably many more. In my other reporting, I've identified other CIA records that are still being withheld. I found that the CIA had asked the JFK Review Board in 1998 to postpone the release of 1,100 CIA documents not believed relevant to the assassination. I did some searching in the National Archives online database, and there's clearly some records in there that are related to the assassination because they concern personalities who figure in the JFK assassination story. For example, William K. Harvey, CIA officer who ran the CIA's assassination program, known for his open contempt for President Kennedy and his brother. David Phillips, chief of anti-Castro operations in the Western Hemisphere in 1963, and somebody who has figured in conspiratorial speculation in the past. He's certainly somebody who knew about Oswald before the assassination. The CIA is withholding 600 pages of material, of operational files from David Phillips. They're withholding 120 pages on William K. Harvey. I'm trying to impress everybody, the general public and also the CIA, on the imperative of releasing this material. These are interesting people who have figured in questions about who killed Kennedy. We need to get those records out, and my writing at jfkfacts.org, my comments on the subject have really been focused on the imperative of full disclosure. There's also material from other government agencies which hasn't been made public despite the JFK Records Act. In that regard, there's a lot of material from the Church Committee, which investigated CIA abuses of power in the 1970s, which has never been released, and I think would be very relevant to the story today. The CIA has said that they are going to not release this material until 2017, which is the statutory limit. But there is a provision in the law which says that the CIA can request postponement beyond 2017. I fully expect them to do that in the absence of demands from the public. What I'm focusing on now in the 50th anniversary and in the years ahead is creating the pressure and making the case for release of this material as soon as possible. I think it will complete the record of the assassination. It will shed new light on important dimensions of the assassination which we do not know about right now.
Stay tuned for the next installment as we expose week after week 50 lies the Warren Commission would like you to believe.